An awesome race in Brazil, as this circuit delivers a classic once again. There were incidents and accidents and so many on-track overtakes, some of which weren't even DRS assisted. Plus, we have the second first-time race winner of the season in George Russell as Mercedes take the top step of the podium once again. This was a classic, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A Mercedes revival. Mercedes have been knocking on the door of the top 2 teams in the last few races, as they've been consistently fast at every race weekend. But while they've been close in the last few Grand Prix, they've always needed some luck if they wanted to lead the races and were always slightly behind on pace. This weekend in Brazil though, certainly going into the Grand Prix, the Mercedes was the car to beat. The pair were 1-2 on the grid after George Russell got past Verstappen to win the sprint, and Hamilton got to 3rd before being promoted to 2nd after Carlos Sainz's grid drop. So for the first time in 2022, the team were 1-2, a position that the team has grown very accustomed to over the last 8 years in the sport, but a novelty in 2022. In the race itself, George Russell looked comfortable out at the front, managing the pace exceptionally well, just as we saw when he raced for the Mercedes team in Bahrain in 2020. He was incredibly calm and offered clear and concise information for his team to ensure they worked together to produce their best performance of the year. Mercedes themselves were hunting for a 1-2 finish despite Hamilton's collision with Verstappen, a topic that we'll definitely be covering later on. It was great to see Mercedes revive their form as they managed to win their first Grand Prix of 2022 in style, as they converted a 1-2 on the grid to a 1-2 at the checkered flag. The inter-team rivalry at Mercedes has been fascinating to watch this year, as George Russell has come into the team and has been ahead of Lewis Hamilton throughout the season so far. So it was always going to be a question of which Mercedes driver would be the one to secure the win, and with the late safety car to recover Norris's stranded McLaren, it made it very interesting indeed, with both Mercedes able to race until the eventual 11-lap dash to the flag. This in itself was a bold decision for Mercedes, as they set the precedent regarding whether the drivers would be able to race for the win or if they would secure the 1-2 finish. But with the pace of George Russell at the front in the end, it didn't even seem like the pair would be able to compete against each other, as he managed the gap to Hamilton with a deserved victory to add to his sprint race win yesterday. For Mercedes to get that race win in the penultimate race of the season is so important for the whole team with their momentum going into the winter. The team were so far behind in the early stages of 2022, and so to now get a 1-2 finish, something that they didn't achieve throughout the entirety of 2021, they'll be very happy indeed, and this performance for George Russell, Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes is clearly deserving of a green box. It's going to be fascinating to see how they get on going into the final round and on into 2023. Ferrari recover, but still lose ground. Ferrari were in a tough spot this weekend as they made a mistake with Charles Leclerc in qualifying on Friday to put him on intermediate tyres when the rest of the runners went with slicks. Carlos Sainz lost out with a 5-place grid drop for bringing new engine parts this weekend, and in the race itself, Charles Leclerc lost out again after being hit by Lando Norris, which sent him down the order and seemingly out of contention. So it was a mix of self-inflicted and unfortunate incidents that saw Ferrari in a tricky position during the race, but with strong race strategy and being on the right tyres at the right time in the final stint, the team ensured they were able to get past Sergio Perez on the wrong tyres, and they secured 3rd and 4th in the race. A very strong result considering their challenges over this weekend, but still not great in the context of the team that they lost out to this weekend. Mercedes are the team that they're fighting against for 2nd in the championship, and coming into this Grand Prix, Ferrari were 36 points ahead. But with the 1-2 finish for the Silver Arrows, Ferrari are now just 19 points ahead, meaning the final round in Abu Dhabi is going to be very interesting with the Constructors' standings battle between these teams. If Ferrari fail to come 2nd in the Constructors' Championship this year, then it would be an awful result for that team. This was of course the team which had the best car in the first few rounds of the year. There was sort of a silver lining for the team, with Leclerc ending up level on points with Sergio Perez in their fight for 2nd in the drivers' standings, and this came despite desperate calls on the radio from Charles Leclerc to let him swap positions with Sainz for the final podium spot. That also came about after Max Verstappen refused to let Perez back past at the end of the race, with a defiant radio message to the Red Bull team. So despite a decent race to finish 3rd and 4th, I think it's got to be an amber box for Ferrari. This result was a real warning sign of how far they've fallen relative to their rivals, and it'll be interesting to see how it ends up after the final race next weekend. old rivals come together again. It was a battle between Mercedes and Red Bull this weekend, with Ferrari a bit further behind after Sainz's engine penalty and Leclerc's mistake in Q3, resulting in him being further down the order. And it became a situation which felt very similar to last year when F1 came to Brazil, with the two championship contenders locked in a battle where every point was critical. Today, the stakes weren't as high, particularly for Red Bull, who have both world championships secured already. But there is clearly still a rivalry between Hamilton and Verstappen, who came together into turn 2. It was a close fight after the safety car restart, as Verstappen was ahead of the Mercedes going into turn 1, and then dropped back but was considerably alongside Hamilton into turn 2. The pair then made contact as Hamilton seemed to close the door on the world champion. It was an incident that saw both drivers dropping down the order, and Verstappen in particular was forced to stop for repairs, which saw his afternoon ruined. The incident saw Verstappen receive a 5-second penalty, presumably with the stewards expecting him to back out as he wasn't alongside his rival enough when going for the move. But for me, on the face of it, I don't see this decision in the same way. I think that Verstappen was entitled to more room than he received, but it just seems like it's a classic 50-50 racing incident, or perhaps even a penalty on Hamilton's side for closing the door. Both drivers could have done more to avoid the collision for me, so to penalise Max feels very harsh. Of course, I don't have the same information available to me as the FIA does, so perhaps there was something on one of the onboards that I haven't been able to see yet, but I was surprised to see that penalty go in that direction. We have seen clarification from the FIA at the beginning of the year, which does state that to be entitled to racing room when trying to overtake on the inside, you have to be a significant way alongside the car ahead, which is perhaps the clarification the stewards interpreted. What is great to see though is these two drivers being able to fight on merit once again. As I mentioned earlier, Mercedes have been brilliant in this race weekend, and it seems like they have certainly bridged the gap to the Ferrari, and on this weekend they were up there with Red Bull as well. If this trajectory of development continues on into 2023, then I'm definitely excited for the next season, considering there could be 3 teams in the hunt for race wins. This incident was reminiscent of 2021, and for me, I think the penalty deserves an amber box for the FIA. It's something that I'm not sure of, but it's an interesting talking point from this Grand Prix. A sprint race to remember. Much has been said about the sprint race weekend format in Formula 1, and not a lot of it has been positive. But I think we can all agree that the sprint race this weekend was one of, if not the best, that we've seen yet. It seems like the circuit in Sao Paulo is really well suited to the shortened race distance. It all began with a brilliant qualifying session in changeable conditions on Friday evening, with it all about being on the right tyres at the right time. We saw some teams getting it very wrong, with Ferrari putting Leclerc out on the intermediate tyres for example, but we also saw some teams getting it very right, as Haas took advantage of their position in the pit lane to get Kevin Magnussen out first into Q3, and as a result, he had the best track conditions of anyone. The Danish driver then managed to secure pole position for the sprint, an awesome achievement. The sprint race itself was full of excitement, and it was arguably a great advert for reverse grid sprints, as it made things very interesting indeed, with some drivers making their way up the order like Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, while Magnussen tried his best to hold on to the points paying positions, which he achieved with an 8th place result. Through the race itself, different teams tried different strategies, with Verstappen going for the medium compound tyre, with the other front runners going for the softs. This made it an interesting sprint, as it exposed a potential Red Bull weakness with the tyre degradation, but it also levelled the playing field in terms of performance. Imagine if this championship had been going down to the wire between Red Bull and Ferrari. Mercedes would surely be ruining their party and complicating their title battle. The sprint race debate is an interesting one, and I think it was a brilliant example of this format's potential this weekend. And actually, considering the weather conditions this weekend, we got lucky with the mixed up grid after the Friday qualifying. Not all sprint races are like this one, as we know, but it feels like there could be some tweaks which could improve things, such as making the sprint race a reverse grid, or perhaps even running 2 separate qualifying sessions, which has been a suggestion floating around the paddock this weekend. With 6 sprints scheduled for 2023, this is a format that seems to be here to stay, and if they all run like this one, then I won't be complaining. So for me, it's a green box for the F1 sprint this weekend. Fernando Alonso's Sunday recovery. Fernando Alonso had a tough time in the sprint race, with not 1 but 2 incidents in his on-track battle with Esteban Ocon. The teammates clashed into turn 4 with Ocon forcing Alonso off the circuit, and then they clashed again in the final corner with Alonso hitting the Frenchman and losing some of his front wing in the process. This saw Alonso dropping down the sprint order after a stop for repairs, and in the end he started this race in 17th position on the grid. The race itself was a strong one in terms of strategy for Alpine as they kept their noses clean and managed to navigate their way up the order. They were a team on the right tyres in the end as they had the soft compound available to them, and Alonso in particular did very well to overtake Sergio Perez for 5th and then even kept Verstappen behind him in those closing stages. That result was brilliant for Alonso and for Alpine as they've now all but secured 4th in the standings with both McLarens retiring from this race. Alonso is clearly very frustrated with his team and in particular his teammate, and I don't think that the pair are particularly good friends, but despite this, Alonso still delivered for the team with 5th position this weekend. A great result from 17th on the grid and certainly deserving of a green box for his performance today after a disappointing performance in Saturday's sprint. Honourable mentions. The only honourable mention for me today goes to Valtteri Bottas, the driver that has struggled with Alfa Romeo in the second half of the season, but despite that, he's got 2 points for 9th position today in Brazil. An awesome race in Sao Paulo, and it opens the questions for what could be going into next season. It seems like we're getting closer at the front already, which bodes well for the future.